40,000 soldiers. 200 cannons. Supply trains stretching 10 miles across the Hungarian plains. In the autumn of 1552, the Ottoman Empire aimed its full war machine at a single hilltop fortress most maps didn't bother to name. Inside that fortress, 2,000 people. A few hundred soldiers. Brave men. Trained men. But nowhere near enough. The rest? Bakers. Blacksmiths. Farmers. Vineyard workers. Priests. Women who had never touched a weapon before that month. Children who had never seen blood. The kind of people empires overlook, until they become the only thing standing between that empire and everything behind it. One of those people, a wild-haired young man covered in gunpowder burns, was building bombs out of wine barrels in a smoke-filled workshop near the courtyard. Nobody believed they would work. Half the garrison thought he'd blow himself up before the Ottomans even arrived. He barely had enough materials for a single day of fighting. One shot. One chance. If he was wrong, every man, woman, and child behind those walls would die before sunset. His name was Gergely Bornemissza. You've never heard of him. By the end of this story, you won't forget him. But here's what separates this siege from every battle you've ever studied. The Ottoman Empire had never lost a siege like this. Not once. Not in 150 years. Their engineers had earned their reputation fortress by fortress across 3 continents. Every wall they targeted came down. Every garrison that resisted was crushed. So what happened at Eger that shattered their perfect record? The answer isn't what you think. It wasn't superior weapons. It wasn't a relief army thundering over the hills. No one was coming. The professional soldiers inside Eger were outnumbered 20 to 1 before you even counted the civilians. And those civilians, the people with no training, no military obligation, and every reason to flee, became the reason the fortress survived. The soldiers knew the odds were fatal. They stayed anyway. That was their oath. Their training. But the civilians had no oath. No training. No obligation. They chose to stay. They chose to fight beside the soldiers who couldn't win without them. And that choice changes everything about how this story ends. To understand why Eger matters, you have to understand what came before it. You have to understand why, by 1552, fighting the Ottomans wasn't bravery. It was suicide. 26 years earlier, Hungary died. Not slowly. Not in stages. In a single afternoon. The Battle of Mohacs. August 29, 1526. The Hungarian king, Louis II, was 20 years old. More interested in tournaments than tactics. He rode onto a flat, open plain with his entire army and charged straight into the Ottoman line. The battle lasted less than 2 hours. The Hungarian army was destroyed. 16,000 men killed. The king fled on horseback, reached a swollen creek, and drowned. His body wasn't recovered for months. His horse was found first. One afternoon. One battle. One kingdom, gone. But here's the part that most history books gloss over. Mohacs wasn't just a military defeat. It was the death of belief. After the king drowned, Hungary didn't just lose territory. It lost its will. The kingdom fractured into 3 pieces. The Ottomans swallowed the east. The Habsburgs grabbed the west. The heartland, the villages, the farms, the ordinary people, was left to fend for itself under the shadow of an empire that never stopped expanding. And then the fortresses started falling. One by one. Year by year. Each collapse faster than the last. Buda, the proud capital, surrendered in 1541. The Ottomans walked in almost unopposed. Székesfehérvár fell. Veszprém. Szolnok. Names that once meant safety became names that meant ash. Every time a fortress fell, the message rippled northward. Every plume of smoke on the horizon whispered the same thing to every village, every town, every remaining garrison. They are coming. And no one can stop them. In 26 years, the Ottoman Empire had consumed an entire kingdom. Fortress by fortress. City by city. Not a single garrison had held. So by 1552, surrender wasn't cowardice. It was the only rational choice left. You don't fight a flood. You don't argue with gravity. And you don't resist an army that hasn't lost in living memory. That's what makes Eger different from every siege before it. That's what most documentaries get wrong. They show you the walls. They show you the cannons. They don't show you this, the 26 years of unbroken defeat that made Eger's decision to fight the most irrational act in European military history. These people didn't just face an army. They faced a certainty. Everyone, their allies, their king, their neighbors, had already accepted the outcome. Eger would fall. It was just a matter of when. And Eger said no. Now. Look at the fortress itself. Strip away the legend. Strip away the myth. What's actually there? A hilltop. Vineyards below it. Wheat fields stretching to the river. Stone walls, honey-colored, weathered, cracked in places no one had bothered to repair for decades. 3 wells. A handful of cannons too small to match Ottoman firepower. Enough grain and salted meat to feed 2,000 mouths for 2 months. Soldiers and civilians eating from the same stores. Sharing the same walls. Facing the same cannons. The only difference between them? Some had armor. Most didn't. This wasn't a grand citadel. This wasn't Constantinople. This was a border fort. The kind of place empires forget about until they need it. But Eger sat on something the Ottomans couldn't ignore. The road north. The only road. The road that led directly to the silver mines of Upper Hungary, the richest mineral deposits in Central Europe. Whoever controlled those mines controlled the wealth that funded armies, built navies, and kept empires breathing. If Eger fell, the Ottomans would hold the key to Habsburg finances. Vienna would be exposed. The economic backbone of Christian Europe would snap. Eger wasn't just a fortress. It was a lock on a door. And the Ottomans were bringing every key they had. But here's what the Ottoman commanders didn't know. That lock had a flaw. A crack. Running through the southern bastion like a scar. Old. Deep. Weathered by a century of border storms. Most inspectors would have walked right past it. The new fortress commander didn't walk past it. He found it on his first inspection along the ramparts. Ran his fingers along the gap. Tapped the stone. Listened to the way it echoed. And he understood, right there, in that moment, that this crack would decide everything. When the Ottoman cannons arrived, and they would arrive, every gunner would search for the weakest point in the wall. They'd probe. They'd test. They'd find this fissure. And they'd pound it. Over and over. Hour after hour. Until it broke apart. The entire defense of Eger came down to one question: could he solve a problem at this crack that no fortress commander had ever solved before? The answer didn't come from a general. It didn't come from Vienna. It didn't come from any military manual ever written. It came from a smoke-filled workshop in the courtyard. From a man covered in burned scars who spent his nights mixing gunpowder into ceramic pots. A man most of the garrison called a lunatic. We'll get to him. But not yet. Because first, you need to see what was marching toward Eger. You need to understand the scale. If you don't understand what these 2,000 people were staring at, nothing else in this story makes sense. Far to the south. The city of Adrianople. The Ottoman war machine stirs. Two commanders received the order. Ahmed Pasha, a man who had cracked the walls of Rhodes when Europe's greatest knights couldn't hold them. Ali Pasha, whose name emptied towns from Belgrade to the Persian border. Entire populations heard he was marching and packed their belongings before his army was even visible on the horizon. Together, they assembled 40,000 men. Elite Janissaries. The most disciplined infantry in the world. Taken from their families as boys. Raised for one single purpose, combat. They didn't break. They didn't panic. They followed orders until the mission was done or they were dead. Nothing in between. Sipahi cavalry. Fast. Ruthless. Designed to encircle, cut supply lines, and run down anyone who tried to flee. Engineers who had shattered the strongest walls in the Mediterranean, in the Balkans, in North Africa. Men who studied stone the way surgeons study bone, looking for the fracture point. But none of that was the real threat. The real threat was the artillery. Camels and oxen groaned under the weight of bronze monsters. Basilisks, massive siege cannons, each capable of hurling a 200-pound stone ball. One hit could crack a wall. 10 hits could collapse it. The Ottomans didn't fire 10 times. They fired 4 days. Without stopping. Without mercy. Falcons, lighter, faster cannons built to target individual defenders on the ramparts. Mortars, designed to lob explosive shells over walls and into courtyards. You couldn't hide from mortars. You couldn't duck. If you were inside the fortress, you were inside the target. Supply trains stretched for miles behind the army. Wagons stacked with powder, timber, food, medical supplies. Blacksmiths hammered through the night forging replacement parts for cannons that never went cold. Drums rolled as columns formed. The Ottoman siege engineers had a reputation they'd earned one shattered fortress at a time. They turned stone walls into dust. That was their craft. That was their record. Unbroken. And on a warm autumn morning, as mist clung to the river, 40,000 men began walking north. 40,000 footsteps. 200 cannons. 10 miles of supplies. Their destination? A speck on the map. A crumbling hilltop fort surrounded by vineyards. Think about that. You're standing on that wall. You have no army marching to rescue you. Your allies have written you off. Your king is 1,000 miles away. If you're a soldier, maybe you stand your ground. That's your training. That's your oath. But what if you're not a soldier? What if you're a baker? A mother? A vineyard worker who has never held anything heavier than a pruning hook? And someone puts a pike in your hands and points at the wall. Do you climb up? Do you stand beside the soldiers who can't win without you? Or do you find a way out before the gates close forever? The people of Eger answered that question. Every one of them. Soldier and civilian alike. Their answer shocked Europe. It terrified the Ottoman High Command. And 500 years later, it still carries weight. If stories like this grip you, the ones where the math says impossible but ordinary people fight anyway, hit that subscribe button right now. Because this siege is about to get much worse before it gets better. The army marches. Dust clouds rise south of the river Tisza. Then smoke. Then abandoned farms, emptied by villagers who knew what was coming and chose to run while running was still possible. Inside Eger, scouts gallop through the gates. Their horses foam at the mouth. Their reports are short. Clipped. Terrified. Dust. Smoke. Movement. Thousands. Tens of thousands. Coming north. Fast. 3 weeks. That's how much warning the fortress gets. 3 weeks to prepare for the largest army most of these people will ever see. And standing in the courtyard, listening to the scout reports with no expression on his face, is the man who will hold it all together, or watch it all burn. István Dobó. Newly appointed captain of Eger. Not a hero. Not yet. A gaunt, quiet man with a reputation built not on glory, but on something far more useful. Composure. He'd held smaller forts against Ottoman raiding parties. Not through reckless charges. Not through rousing speeches. Through turning chaos into order. Through seeing what others missed. Through making decisions before anyone else realized a decision was needed. But Dobó made one choice in his first 48 hours at Eger that broke every accepted rule of siege defense. A choice that military historians still argue about to this day. A choice that, on paper, should have gotten every person in the fortress killed. Instead, it saved them all. And that choice only worked because Dobó understood something about human beings that the Ottoman commanders never did. Something no cannon could crack. Something no army, no matter how large, could overwhelm. That's where this story turns. Every fortress commander in Hungary had followed the same playbook for 30 years. When the Ottomans approached, you counted your soldiers. You measured your walls. You calculated how many days you could hold. And if the numbers didn't add up, and they never did, you opened negotiations. You surrendered on terms. You lived. István Dobó threw that playbook into the fire. His first order at Eger wasn't about walls. It wasn't about weapons. It wasn't about rationing food or positioning cannons. His first order was about people. He gathered every soul inside the fortress. Soldiers in their armor. Civilians in their work clothes. Women still dusted with flour. Men still smelling of the forge. Children standing on tiptoe to see over the crowd. He stood on the steps of the inner keep and spoke in a voice that carried to the back wall. No grand rhetoric. No promises of glory. Just this. No one speaks the word surrender. Not in jest. Not in prayer. Not in whisper. Anyone who does, soldier or civilian, will be executed before the sentence leaves their mouth. Silence. Absolute silence. Then he continued. Every person in this fortress has a role. Every pair of hands has a task. If you can lift a stone, you are a defender. If you can carry water, you are a defender. If you can stir a pot or thread a needle or swing a hammer, you are a defender. There is no division here. No soldier and civilian. From this moment, there is only Eger. This was the decision that broke every rule. Standard siege doctrine across Europe was clear: civilians are a liability. They consume food. They spread panic. They clog corridors during assaults. Every military manual said the same thing: evacuate non-combatants or lock them in cellars where they can't interfere. Dobó did the opposite. He made every civilian a participant. Not passengers hiding behind soldiers. Partners standing beside them. But here's the part no one expected, including Dobó himself. That oath didn't just organize the defense. It changed the psychology of the fortress. When every person has a role, no one feels helpless. Helplessness is what breaks a siege from the inside. Not cannonballs. Not starvation. The feeling that you're trapped and useless, that is what makes people open gates in the middle of the night. Dobó eliminated helplessness in a single sentence. The Ottomans had cannons that could shatter stone. They had no weapon for what Dobó just built. The assignments came fast. Dobó moved through the fortress like a man cataloging the contents of a burning house, calm, precise, wasting nothing. His lieutenant, Miklós Szilárdy, walked beside him. A soldier's soldier. Quiet. Dependable. The kind of man who didn't need orders repeated. Szilárdy. The southern bastion. You saw the crack. I saw it. That's where they'll focus every cannon. I want masons on it today. Mortar mixed with goat's blood, the old technique. It binds tighter than standard mix. Buy us extra hours when the bombardment starts. Hours. Not days. Hours. That wall is going to fall. I'm not pretending otherwise. Which is why I want carpenters building a second line. Wooden barricades. Packed earth. Sandbags. Anything that can absorb impact. When the stone breaks, and it will break, we fall back to timber and dirt. Szilárdy nodded. No argument. No false optimism. Just execution. The fortress became a construction site. Masons hauled buckets of mortar up narrow stairways, pressing the reddish-brown mixture into every fissure they could find. The goat's blood gave the compound a dark, unsettling color, but the technique was proven. Fortresses across the Balkans had used it for generations. It wouldn't make the wall invincible. Nothing would. But it would force the Ottoman gunners to work harder for every crack they widened. Carpenters, men whose hands knew oak and ash the way a painter knows color, constructed wooden frames behind the most vulnerable sections. Cross-braced. Packed with rubble and earth. Not elegant. Functional. A wall behind the wall. A fallback position for the moment the outer stone gave way. The gates received oak beams thick as a man's thigh, banded with iron strips old János forged himself. 6 men struggled to swing them shut during the first test. Dobó watched, satisfied. If 6 defenders could barely move them, no battering ram would do it quickly. But here's what kept Dobó awake at night. Not the walls. Not the gates. The wells. 3 deep wells served the entire fortress. Lose them and thirst would kill the garrison faster than any assault. Poison 1, drop a dead animal into the shaft, contaminate the water, and 2,000 people would face a choice between drinking death and dying dry. Dobó posted guards at each well. Around the clock. No exceptions. No one approached without authorization. Water was drawn on a schedule, rationed, distributed evenly. Soldiers and civilians received the same portion. No rank. No privilege. The same cup of water for the captain as for the baker's apprentice. Food was calculated to the last sack. Grain. Salted meat. Barley. Enough for 2 months if portions were strict. No waste. Scraps fed to the animals that would themselves become food when the grain ran low. Ammunition troubled him most. Arrows, decent supply, but finite. Lead balls for the few muskets they had, limited. Cannons, a handful, none of them capable of matching Ottoman range. Every shot Eger fired would need to count. No suppression fire. No warning volleys. Every trigger pulled had to put a man down. The math was brutal. Survive until the first snow. That was the entire strategy. The Ottoman army couldn't sustain a siege through a Hungarian winter. Their supply lines would freeze. Their troops, many recruited from warmer provinces, would suffer. If Eger held until the cold came, the Ottomans would have to withdraw or watch their army rot from the inside. 38 days. That was Dobó's calculation. Hold for 38 days and the weather would do what no garrison could. Every preparation was aimed at that number. Not victory. Survival. 38 days of absorbing punishment without breaking. While Dobó fortified stone and rationed grain, a different kind of work was happening in a cluttered workshop near the inner courtyard. Gergely Bornemissza didn't look like a man who could change the outcome of a siege. Young. Thin. Ink-stained fingers that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the after-effects of a chemical burn he'd suffered 2 weeks earlier when a batch of powder ignited 6 inches from his face. His workshop was chaos made physical. Clay pots stacked in uneven towers. Barrels in various stages of being hollowed out. A scarred wooden table covered in sketches, most of them crossed out, revised, crossed out again. The air smelled of sulfur and pine resin. A thin haze of smoke hung near the ceiling from his last experiment. Most of the garrison avoided the workshop. The sounds that came from it, sudden hisses, sharp cracks, the occasional muffled boom followed by cursing, did not inspire confidence. But Dobó had watched Bornemissza work for weeks. Had asked questions. Had studied the results. And behind the chaos, he'd seen something no one else bothered to look for. Method. Bornemissza wasn't guessing. He was testing. Every failed experiment narrowed the possibilities. Every explosion taught him something about ratios, containment, and ignition timing. He was doing what no military academy had ever formalized, building a new category of weapon from raw principles and kitchen supplies. 3 designs survived his testing. 3 weapons no Ottoman army had ever encountered. The first, barrel bombs. Hollowed wine barrels packed with gunpowder, iron nails, and brimstone. The interior was scored with grooves, channels that directed the blast outward in a ring of shrapnel. The outside was sealed with pine resin to keep moisture out. A slow fuse threaded through a hole in the lid. Designed for one purpose, roll them downhill into advancing infantry. The second, clay spheres. Smaller. Handheld. About the size of a man's fist. Packed with a compound Bornemissza had developed through trial and error, an incendiary paste that combined rendered fat, powdered sulfur, and groundite. The paste had a specific and terrifying property. It clung to whatever it touched. Cloth. Skin. Leather. And once lit, it burned at temperatures high enough to melt through a wool tunic in seconds. Short fuse. Thrown by hand. Effective range, 30 paces. The third, fire pots. Ceramic vessels, repurposed cooking pots, mostly, filled with boiling oil mixed with quicklime. The quicklime was the key. On contact with any moisture, water, sweat, blood, it reacted violently. The temperature spiked. The burn deepened. Pouring water on it made it worse. Designed to be dropped from walls onto soldiers climbing ladders. Bornemissza laid his sketches on Dobó's table one evening. His voice was steady, but his eyes moved fast, the look of a man who knew he was asking to be trusted with lives. They will bombard us. They will send men up the walls. Standard tactics. They've done it 100 times. But every one of those assaults depends on soldiers being able to reach the wall alive. My job is to make sure they can't. Dobbo studied the drawings. Touched the edge of a barrel bomb sketch. Looked up. How many can you build? Bornemissza hesitated. This was the part he didn't want to say. Enough for one full engagement. Maybe two if I use smaller charges. After that, I'm out of sulfur. Out of iron stock. Out of resin. One engagement. Maybe two. Against an army that could assault every day for a month. Do it. Build everyone you can. And Bornemissza, don't miss. The fortress settled into its final rhythm. Every hour produced something. Arrowheads by the hundred from old János's forge, his hammer falling in a steady beat that became the heartbeat of the preparation. Sandbags filled by hands of every size. Laszlo, 10 years old, too young for a sword, old enough to carry, dragged sacks across the courtyard until a soldier told him to rest. He didn't rest. He switched to a lighter load and kept moving. The women organized themselves without being asked. Marta, the baker whose ovens had fed the town for 15 years, converted her workspace into a medical station. Bread could wait. Wounds couldn't. She boiled rags for bandages. Prepared herbal poultices from recipes her grandmother had used. Set aside clean water in sealed vessels, ready for the moment the first casualties arrived. Ilona, a seamstress whose hands could thread a needle in dim light, took charge of ammunition supply. Sorting arrows by condition. Counting lead balls. Ensuring every fighting position along the wall had a stockpile within arm's reach. Her system was simple, precise, and it meant that no defender would ever reach for a weapon and find an empty shelf. These weren't soldiers following orders. These were people building a machine out of their own skills. The baker became a healer. The seamstress became a quartermaster. The blacksmith became an armory. Dobbo hadn't just assigned roles. He'd unlocked something in these people, a sense that their ordinary skills, applied to an extraordinary moment, could mean the difference between holding and falling. And then the scouts came. Late afternoon. 2 riders. Horses lathered and staggering. They'd ridden hard enough to nearly kill their mounts. One word carried across the courtyard before they even dismounted. Tomorrow. Tomorrow. The army would be visible by dawn. The bombardment could begin by midday. That night, no one pretended to sleep. Torches burned along every section of wall. Soldiers checked straps and edges one final time. Families held each other in the courtyards, not crying, not speaking, just holding on. A mother wrapped her daughter's hands in strips of cloth so she could carry stones without her skin tearing open. Old János set down his hammer for the first time in days. Flexed his fingers. Picked it up again. From the highest tower, the fortress priest raised a wooden crucifix against the darkening sky. His voice was barely above a whisper, but in the stillness, everyone heard it. Lord, grant us strength. Not victory. Strength. Below the walls, the valley lay quiet. Dark. Fields of wheat and vines stretching toward a horizon that, by morning, would be filled with something else entirely. And somewhere in the distance, faint, almost imagined, the sound of drums. Not yet visible. Not yet close. But coming. Dawn broke the color of dried blood. The mist hadn't lifted from the valley when the first shapes appeared on the southern ridge. Not soldiers yet. Just movement. Dark masses shifting against the pale sky. Then the glint of metal. Then the sound, a low, rolling thunder that wasn't thunder at all. Drums. thousands of them, beating in a rhythm that vibrated through the stone walls and into the chests of every person standing on the ramparts. And then the army revealed itself. They came over the ridge like a tide. Column after column. Infantry in ordered blocks. Cavalry spreading across the flanks. Banners snapping in the morning wind, crimson, green, gold. The valley floor disappeared beneath them. Wheat fields trampled flat. Vineyards crushed under boots and hooves. From the walls, a soldier whispered what everyone was thinking. God in heaven. There's no end to them. He was almost right. The deployment took 3 hours. 3 hours of watching the valley fill. 3 hours of counting banners and failing to keep track. 3 hours of understanding, in a way that no scout report could convey, exactly what 40,000 men looked like when they stopped marching and started preparing to kill. But the soldiers and civilians on those walls didn't run. Didn't weep. Didn't collapse. They watched. They waited. They gripped their weapons tighter. And then the cannons arrived. Oxen strained against harnesses. Wooden sledges screamed across rocky ground. One by one, the bronze monsters were dragged into position on the slopes facing Eger's southern wall. The basilisks came first. Massive. Each barrel longer than 2 men lying end to end. Their mouths gaped open, black circles aimed at the fortress like the eyes of something hungry. Engineers swarmed around them. Leveling the ground. Adjusting angles. Packing earth into berms that would absorb recoil. Officers shouted measurements. Gunners checked powder charges. Loaders stood ready with stone balls that took 2 men to lift. From the ramparts, Dobbo watched in silence. Salardi stood beside him. They're targeting the southern bastion. The crack. I know. The mortar won't hold long against those. I know. Salardi waited for more. Orders. A plan. Something. Dobbo just kept watching. Counting cannons. Calculating angles. Mapping the bombardment in his mind before the first shot was fired. Then, a single command echoed across the Ottoman line. Distant. Barely audible. But unmistakable. Fire. The first basilisk roared. The sound wasn't like anything the defenders had heard before. Not a bang. Not a crack. A physical force that punched through the air and slammed into their bodies before the stone ball even arrived. Then, impact. The 200-pound projectile struck the southern wall 8 feet from the ground. Stone exploded inward. A section of the rampart simply vanished, replaced by a cloud of dust and debris that rained down on the courtyard below. The wall shuddered. Men stumbled. Women screamed. And before the dust settled, another roar. Another impact. Another section of wall cracking like bone. Again. Boom. Again. Boom. 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 The rhythm was merciless. 1 shot every 30 seconds. Each one aimed at the same weakened section. Each one widening the cracks that Dobbo had marked on his first inspection. The goat's blood mortar held, for now. But everyone could see the truth. The fissure was growing. Spreading upward and outward like lightning frozen in stone. By noon, the crack had doubled in width. Eger's own cannons fired back. Smaller. Weaker. Their balls fell short or bounced harmlessly off the earthwork berms protecting the Ottoman gunners. Archers loosed volleys that arced across the valley and disappeared into the sea of tents. Effective casualties, near zero. The defenders couldn't fight back. Not yet. All they could do was endure. Water. Clear the debris. Mark every new fracture. Dobó's voice cut through the chaos. Work crews scrambled. Women with buckets doused fires sparked by friction and shattered stone. Men dragged wounded away from the impact zone. Old János hammered timber braces into cracks before they could spread further, his face set in grim concentration, ignoring the chunks of masonry falling around him. Laszlo ran messages between positions. His legs burned. His lungs burned. He didn't stop. By late afternoon, the bombardment paused. Not from mercy. The gun crews needed rest. Barrels needed to cool. But in that pause, movement on the Ottoman line. Infantry forming up. Shields raised. Pikes forward. The assault was coming. Janissaries led the advance. 500 of them in the first wave. Moving uphill in tight formation. Their discipline was visible from the walls, every step synchronized, every shield aligned, every pike at the same angle. These weren't conscripts. These were men raised from childhood for exactly this moment. Behind them, more infantry. Thousands more. Ready to pour through any gap the Janissaries created. Dobó turned to find Bornemissza already at his shoulder. The inventor's face was pale, but his eyes were steady. Now. Now. Bornemissza sprinted along the rampart to where his team waited. 10 men. Each gripping a barrel bomb. The barrels looked almost absurd, wine containers, the kind you'd see in any tavern cellar. Except for the fuses protruding from their lids. Except for the smell of sulfur leaking from their seams. The Janissaries were 200 paces out. 150. 100. Light them. Sparks. The fuses caught. Hissing. Burning toward the payload. Roll. The barrels tumbled over the wall's edge. Bouncing down the rocky slope. Picking up speed. Wobbling wildly on the uneven ground. The Janissaries saw them coming. Debris from the bombardment, that's what it looked like. Chunks of masonry jarred loose by cannon fire. Nothing to worry about. They adjusted their formation slightly to let the barrels pass between their ranks. The first barrel struck a shield. Bounced sideways. Rolled into the center of the leading squad. And detonated. The explosion ripped outward in a ring of fire and iron. Shrapnel, the nails Bornemissza had packed inside, tore through shields, through armor, through flesh. Men didn't fall. They disappeared. Replaced by smoke and screaming. Before the survivors could react, the second barrel. The third. The fourth. Boom. 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 The Janissary formation shattered. Soldiers stumbled over bodies. Screamed orders that no one could hear. Tried to retreat and collided with the ranks still pressing forward. And then the clay spheres came. Bornemissa's team hurled them in arcs, small, fist-sized projectiles trailing sparks. They landed among the confused infantry and burst on impact. The incendiary paste splattered outward. Clung to tunics. Ignited. Men caught fire. Not the kind of fire you can smother by dropping and rolling. This fire spread. Intensified. Soldiers tore at their own clothing. Beat at flames that wouldn't die. stumbled into their comrades and set them burning too. The archers and musketeers on the walls saw their moment. Arrows rained down, finding gaps in armor that was no longer being held in formation. Lead balls punched through the chaos. Stones, thrown by hand, thrown by women who had never killed before, crashed into helmets and shoulders. The Ottoman advance didn't retreat. It collapsed. Men fled downhill. Threw away shields. Trampled the wounded. The disciplined formation that had marched up the slope dissolved into a mob running for the safety of the tents. By sunset, the valley below the walls was empty except for the dead. That night, the defenders leaned against cold stone and tried to remember how to breathe. Ears ringing. Faces black with powder residue. Hands shaking from hours of gripping weapons that suddenly had nothing to fight. A strange silence hung over the fortress. Not peace. Shock. The kind of quiet that follows a thunderclap. Dobó found Bornemissza in his workshop. The inventor was already working, hands moving automatically, sorting through his remaining supplies. Counting. Recounting. His expression told Dobó everything he needed to know. How many barrels left? 3. Maybe 4 if I reduce the powder charge. Clay spheres. Enough for one more engagement. Maybe. One more engagement. Against an army that could assault every day for a month. Dobó leaned against the doorframe. For a moment, just a moment, he let the exhaustion show. They'll be angry tomorrow. They won't make the same mistakes. Bornemissza looked up. Then I'll make new weapons. Different ones. Smaller. Faster to build. With what materials? Silence. Bornemissza didn't have an answer. Dobó pushed off the frame. Straightened his shoulders. The exhaustion vanished, tucked away somewhere deep where it couldn't slow him down. Buy me time, Bornemissza. That's all I need. Time. He walked back into the darkness. 38 days. That was the number. 1 day down. 37 to go. If stories like this grip you, where everything hinges on impossible choices and ordinary people refusing to break, drop a comment right now. Tell me, could you have held that wall? And if you haven't already, hit that like button. It tells the algorithm this story matters. It helps more people find it. Days 3 through 8 blurred into a single grinding nightmare. The Ottomans learned from their first disaster. They didn't charge blindly again. Instead, they dug trenches. Starting 500 paces out and creeping closer every night. Engineers worked in shifts, protected by wooden shields called gabions, carving approach lines through the rocky soil. Each morning, the defenders woke to find the trenches 10 paces nearer. Then 20. Then 30. By day 5, Ottoman soldiers could reach throwing distance of the walls without exposing themselves to direct fire. And the bombardment never stopped. Every dawn began the same way. Basilisks roaring. Stone balls slamming into the southern wall. The crack, the one Dobó had found on his first inspection, widened hour by hour. The goat's blood mortar crumbled. The timber braces splintered. By the end of day 5, a man could crawl through the gap on his hands and knees. Dobó ordered it filled with everything they had. Sandbags. Rubble. Broken furniture. Wagon wheels. Anything that would absorb impact. It wasn't a wall anymore. It was a wound packed with whatever the fortress could spare. Day 6 brought the ladders. Tall. Iron-hooked. Carried forward by teams of soldiers sprinting through the trenches and across the final open ground. They slammed against the walls at 6 points simultaneously, a coordinated assault designed to stretch the defenders thin. Close combat erupted along the ramparts. Pikes thrust through gaps between stones. Swords clashed against scimitars. Boiling water, prepared by Ilona and her crew through the night, poured down onto soldiers climbing the rungs. Screams echoed off the stonework. Blood made the walkways slick. A janissary reached the top of the eastern ladder. He was fast, over the edge before the nearest defender could react. He raised his blade. Salardi met him. The two men collided. Grappled. Rolled along the narrow rampart. The janissary was stronger. Salardi was fighting on his home ground. They struggled for a blade, any blade, and both went over the inner edge together. Salardi survived. Barely. Broken ribs. A gash across his scalp that bled for hours. But he survived. The janissary didn't. Bornemissza deployed his remaining clay spheres on day 7. Fewer than before. Smaller charges. But they still burned. He'd also developed something new overnight, fire pots modified to ignite between ladder rungs. The liquid splashed downward, coating the soldiers below. The ladders themselves caught fire. Men fell, burning, screaming, taking others with them. It worked. Barely. The assault broke. But the wall kept crumbling. By day 8, the fissure had widened to 3 feet. Ottoman cannons targeted it with mechanical precision. One shot every 5 minutes. Each impact sending tremors through the entire southern section. Stones fell inward like gravel. Dust choked the air so thick that defenders tied cloth across their faces just to breathe. Fatigue became the real enemy. Soldiers fought with bandaged hands, blisters torn open, wrapped, torn open again. Many hadn't slept more than 2 hours in 3 days. Reactions slowed. Aim suffered. Men made mistakes they wouldn't have made on day 1. The medical station overflowed. Marta hadn't stopped moving since the bombardment began. Her apron was brown with dried blood. Her voice, once warm, once the voice that called children in for fresh bread, was now a constant, steady murmur. Hold still. This will hurt. Breathe. Hold still. You'll live. Hold still. She said it so many times that the words lost meaning. Became a rhythm. A heartbeat. The sound of survival. And still the wall crumbled. Sunset on day 8. Dobó stood before the gap in the southern wall. 3 feet wide now. Wide enough to see the Ottoman campfires through the dust. Wide enough that tomorrow, when the bombardment resumed, it would double. Triple. Become a breach that couldn't be filled with sandbags and wagon wheels. The wall was going to fall. Not cracking anymore. Not weakening. Collapsing completely. By noon tomorrow, there would be a hole in Eger's defenses wide enough to drive a cart through. And when that happened, 40,000 men would pour through it. Salardi limped to his side. His ribs were wrapped tight. Every breath hurt. But he was standing. The barricade behind the wall. It's as ready as we can make it. Dobó nodded. He'd ordered that barricade built on day 1. Timber. Earth. Sandbags. A second line for exactly this moment. But he knew what Salardi knew. What everyone knew. A barricade wasn't a wall. You couldn't hold a barricade against an army. You could only slow them down. Bleed them. And eventually get overrun. Tomorrow they break through. And when they do, we fight inside the walls. Room by room if we have to. We make them pay for every step. Salardi didn't argue. Didn't offer false hope. Just nodded. In the courtyard below, every able body worked through the gathering darkness. Hauling stone. Dragging timber. Building the last line of defense. Laszlo, his arms shaking, his face hollow with exhaustion, carried sandbags until a soldier finally picked him up and set him on a pile of grain sacks. Rest, boy. You've done enough. I can still carry. Rest. That's an order. Laszlo didn't rest. He waited until the soldier walked away. Then he picked up a smaller bag. Kept moving. From the Ottoman camp, a new sound began. Low. Rhythmic. Growing louder. Drums. Not the marching drums from day one. Something else. Slower. Heavier. A heartbeat counting down to something final. Bornemissza found Dobó on the rampart. The inventor's hands were raw, chemical burns layered over older chemical burns. But he was carrying something. A ceramic pot. Larger than the ones he'd used before. I have enough materials for one more weapon. Larger charges. More iron. I call them hellfire pots. How many? 20. Maybe 25. Enough to stop an assault through a 10-foot breach. Bornemissa's jaw tightened. Asterisk, enough to turn that breach into a graveyard. Once. After that. He didn't finish. He didn't need to. One chance. One weapon. One moment where everything Eger had built would either hold, or burn. The drums kept beating. Tomorrow, the wall would fall. Dawn bled red across the horizon. Not the soft red of sunrise. Something darker. Angrier. As if the sky itself knew what was coming. On the ramparts, defenders stood at their positions. No one had slept. No one had tried. They watched the Ottoman camp stir in the half-light. Watched the gun crews take their positions. Watched the infantry form into assault columns that stretched back farther than the eye could follow. And they watched the cannons turn, every bronze mouth pivoting toward a single point. The crack. 3 feet wide after 8 days of bombardment. Packed with rubble and sandbags and desperation. Held together by prayers and timber braces that groaned under their own weight. It wouldn't hold. Everyone knew it. The question wasn't whether the wall would fall. The question was how many hours they had left. The answer came at first light. Fire. The basilisks roared together. Not in sequence. All at once. A coordinated volley aimed at the same wounded section of wall. 6 200-pound stone balls struck within seconds of each other. The impact was beyond sound. Beyond sensation. The entire southern bastion moved. Stones that had stood for a century shifted in their foundations. Mortar cracked. Timber braces snapped like dry branches. It's going. A soldier's scream, raw, terrified, cut through the dust. And then the wall fell. Not crumbling. Not collapsing in stages. The entire section gave way at once, a roar like a mountain breaking apart. Stone crashed inward. Dust erupted upward in a column that blocked out the sun. The ground shook hard enough to knock men off their feet. When the dust began to clear, the southern bastion was gone. In its place, a gap. Jagged. 10 feet wide at the base. Wide enough for 20 men to charge through shoulder to shoulder. Wide enough to end everything. Below the breach, the Ottoman army surged. Ahmed Pasha raised his scimitar. His voice carried across the valley, amplified by thousands of throats taking up the cry. For the Sultan. For victory. Janissaries sprinted up the slope. Engineers ran beside them, hauling wooden planks to bridge the rubble. Archers provided cover, arrows arcing overhead in dark swarms, forcing the defenders to duck, to hide, to stop shooting back. They poured through the gap. Wave after wave. The first men scrambled over broken stone. The second wave ran over the bodies of those who stumbled. The third wave didn't even slow down. Inside Eger, chaos erupted. But it was controlled chaos. Dobó had prepared for this moment since the day he arrived. The barricade behind the wall, timber, packed earth, sandbags, wagon wheels, stood ready. 2 ranks of defenders formed up behind it. Soldiers in front. Armed civilians behind them. Pikes bristling outward like the spines of a cornered animal. Hold the line. Hold. The first Janissaries crested the rubble and met a wall of iron. Pike points punched through gaps in armor. Men screamed. Fell. Were trampled by the soldiers behind them. The space was narrow, too narrow for the Ottoman numbers to matter. They couldn't flank. Couldn't spread out. They had to push straight through. And straight through meant climbing over their own dead. Dobó fought in the front rank. Not commanding from behind. Not watching from a safe distance. He was in the press of bodies, sword rising and falling, rising and falling. His movements were mechanical. Efficient. No wasted motion. Every strike found flesh. A Janissary broke through the pike line. Young. Fast. His scimitar swung toward Dobó's neck. The captain didn't parry. He stepped inside the swing, too close for the blade to bite, and drove his own sword upward through the gap beneath the man's arm. The Janissary's eyes went wide. Then empty. Dobó shoved the body aside. Raised his voice. Eger holds. The defenders took up the cry. Soldiers. Civilians. The baker with blood on her hands. The blacksmith with his hammer. The seamstress who had never imagined she would scream those words while throwing stones at armored men. Eger holds. But the Ottomans kept coming. Step by step, they pushed the barricade back. Fresh soldiers replaced fallen ones. The defenders had no reserves. Every man on that line had been fighting for 8 days. Muscles burned. Arms shook. Grips slipped on blood-slicked handles. Salardi, ribs still wrapped, every breath a knife in his chest, fought beside Dobó. He blocked a strike. Countered. Missed. Took a cut across his shoulder that he didn't even feel until the blood ran down his arm. They're pushing through. He was right. The line was bending. The barricade was failing. Another minute, maybe 2, and the Ottomans would break into the courtyard beyond. And then it would be over. Bornemissza moved through the chaos like a man walking through a dream. His remaining team followed. 8 men. Each carrying ceramic pots, larger than anything they'd used before. The hellfire pots. His final creation. Everything he had left. He reached the rear of the barricade. Looked over the heads of the struggling defenders. Saw the breach packed with Ottoman soldiers, shoulder to shoulder, pressing forward, an endless tide of armored bodies. The perfect target. Light them. His team struck sparks. Fuses caught. Hissing. Burning down toward the charges inside. Now. The first pot arced over the barricade. A high, spinning trajectory. It cleared the defenders. Cleared the front rank of Ottomans. Landed in the heart of the assault, right where the breach funneled soldiers into a tight mass. Detonation. The pot didn't just explode. It erupted. Gunpowder. Sulfur. Iron shards. A ball of fire and metal that expanded outward in every direction. Men vanished. Others were thrown backward, armor torn, bodies broken. The incendiary compound splattered across cloth and skin and began to burn. Before the smoke cleared, the second pot. The third. The fourth. Boom. 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 23 hellfire pots in under a minute. Each one landing in the press of bodies. Each one turning organized soldiers into screaming chaos. The breach became something no human should have to witness. Fire everywhere. Men burning. Men crawling over bodies trying to escape. Men trampling their own wounded in blind panic. The narrow gap that was supposed to deliver victory had become a trap, walls of rubble on either side, no room to spread out, no way to escape the rain of death from above. The Ottoman advance didn't just stop. It shattered. Soldiers fled back through the breach. Pushed past officers trying to restore order. Fell over the rubble. Crawled if they couldn't run. The disciplined assault dissolved into a mob fighting to get away from the fire. But behind them, more soldiers. Thousands more. Waiting their turn. And the officers were already screaming orders. Already forming new assault columns. Already preparing to send fresh men into the gap. Bornemissza looked at his empty hands. At his team, panting, burned, finished. Nothing left. The hellfire pots were gone. The clay spheres were gone. The barrel bombs were gone. 8 days of preparation burned through in one desperate minute. The next assault would come with nothing to stop it. And then the wind changed. It came without warning. A sudden gust, violent, cold, cutting across the valley from the west. It caught the thick smoke from the Ottoman artillery positions, the black clouds that had been drifting over the battlefield all morning, and drove it backward. Into the breach. Into the Ottoman soldiers still trying to regroup. Into the assault columns forming for the next wave. Smoke poured through the gap like water through a broken dam. Dense. Choking. Blinding. The Ottoman soldiers in the breach couldn't see the defenders. Couldn't see their own officers. Couldn't see anything except the gray-black wall swallowing them whole. The organized counterattack fell apart before it started. Dobó saw it. One heartbeat. One moment of clarity in 9 days of hell. He saw the smoke filling the breach. Saw the Ottoman soldiers stumbling blind. Saw the chaos spreading through their ranks. And he made a choice that broke every rule of defensive warfare. Charge. Not retreat. Not hold the line. Charge. Attack. Push forward into the enemy. The defenders surged over the barricade. Soldiers. Farmers. The blacksmith swinging his hammer like a man possessed. The baker with a pike she could barely lift. Ilona, the seamstress who had spent 8 days carrying ammunition, grabbed a fallen sword and climbed the rubble. Laszlo was there. 10 years old. Carrying a blade too heavy for his arms. He shouldn't have been there. No one had ordered him forward. But he climbed that rubble with everyone else. They slammed into the blinded Ottoman force. Pikes found gaps in armor that couldn't be defended. Swords flashed in the smoke. The Ottomans, disoriented, choking, unable to form ranks, fell back. Then faster. Then broke entirely. They fled down the slope. Threw away weapons. Trampled each other. The retreat became a rout. Officers screamed orders that no one obeyed. The great assault, the wave that was supposed to finally crush Eger, dissolved into a mob of terrified men running for their lives. By noon, the valley below the breach was empty. Only bodies remained. Ottoman bodies. Hundreds of them. Scattered across the slope. Piled in the breach. Burned. Broken. Still. Silence. For the first time in 9 days. No cannons. No drums. No screaming. Just the wind, the same wind that had saved them, moving through the shattered walls. Dobbo stood in the breach. His sword arm hung limp at his side. His tunic was stiff with dried blood, none of it his own. His face was gray with dust and exhaustion. He looked like a dead man who hadn't realized he was supposed to fall. He stared at the valley below. At the Ottoman camp. At the flag still flying. At the army that was still out there, battered, bloodied, but not destroyed. Salardi limped to his side. His shoulder wound had been wrapped with a torn strip of cloth. His ribs screamed with every breath. But he was standing. Still standing. The wall fell. Yes. They came through. Yes. We pushed them back. Dobbo turned. Looked at the breach behind him. At the barricade, broken now, scattered, barely recognizable. At the courtyard beyond, filled with wounded, with exhausted defenders sitting wherever they'd stopped moving, with civilians still gripping weapons they didn't know how to put down. We held. It wasn't a boast. Wasn't a celebration. Just a fact. Quiet. Almost disbelieving. Behind them, Marta emerged from the medical station. Her apron was more red than white. Her hands shook. But her eyes were steady. The wounded need water. We need bandages. We need. She stopped. Looked at the breach. Looked at the empty valley beyond. We held. We held. What you just witnessed, a 10-year-old boy charging into a breach alongside bakers and blacksmiths, that's real history. Not legend. Not exaggeration. Hungarian chronicles recorded it. Survivors remembered it for the rest of their lives. If this story moved you, share it right now. Send this video to someone who needs to hear it. Because stories like this deserve to be remembered. The Ottoman camp did not stir that night. No drums. No chanting. No torches moving between tents. Just stillness. The kind of stillness that follows a catastrophe. Inside Eger, no one celebrated. They were too tired to celebrate. Too hollowed out. They sat where they fell. Drank water in small sips. Let wounds be cleaned without flinching because they no longer had the energy to flinch. Bornemissza sat alone in his empty workshop. His hands, raw, blistered, trembling, rested on the table where his sketches had been. The sketches were gone now. Burned for kindling during the cold nights. The materials were gone. The weapons were gone. He had nothing left to build. But they had held. Old János set down his hammer for the first time since the siege began. His arms wouldn't stop shaking. He didn't try to make them stop. Laszlo slept where he fell, curled against a pile of sandbags, still clutching the sword he'd carried into the breach. Someone draped a blanket over him. He didn't wake. And on the ramparts, on what was left of the ramparts, Dobó kept watch. Staring south. Waiting. Because the Ottoman army was still there. 40,000 men, fewer now, bloodied now, but still there. Still capable of another assault. The siege wasn't over. Not until they marched away. 3 days passed. No assault. No bombardment. No drums. The Ottoman camp stirred with activity, but not the activity of attack. Messengers rode frantically between command tents. Officers argued in tight clusters. Soldiers sat idle, watching the fortress they'd failed to take. Something had broken. Not just the assault. Not just the momentum. Something deeper. The certainty that had carried this army across hundreds of miles, the absolute belief that no wall could stand against them, had cracked worse than Eger's southern bastion. On the morning of the 4th day after the breach, the withdrawal began. The cannons moved first. Teams of oxen dragged the basilisks back onto their sledges. The bronze monsters that had shaken Eger's foundations for 9 straight days were pulled away, barrel by barrel, carriage by carriage, until the slope stood empty. Then the infantry. Column by column. Regiment by regiment. Folding their tents. Loading their wagons. Forming into marching order. Then the cavalry. By noon, the great host was moving south. 40,000 men, fewer now, much fewer, walking away from a hilltop fortress most maps didn't bother to name. On the ramparts, the defenders watched. No one cheered. The energy for cheering had been spent days ago. They simply stood, soldiers and civilians together, and watched the army shrink toward the horizon. Watched the banners disappear over the southern ridge. Watched the dust settle on empty fields that had held death just hours before. Salardi leaned against a broken section of wall. His shoulder wound had been properly bandaged now. His ribs were still cracked. Every breath still hurt. But he was smiling. A small, exhausted smile that looked almost painful. They're leaving. Dobó stood beside him. The captain hadn't moved from the ramparts since the breach. Hadn't slept. Hadn't eaten more than a few bites of bread someone had pressed into his hand. They're leaving. Do you think they'll come back? Dobó watched the last Ottoman cavalry unit disappear over the ridge. Watched the valley return to silence. Watched the wind move through the trampled wheat fields, pushing the smoke away, clearing the air for the first time in 9 days. Perhaps. Someday. But not this year. Not against these walls. He paused. Corrected himself. Not against these people. The fortress exhaled. Not all at once. Slowly. In small moments scattered across the following hours. Marta finally sat down. Her legs simply stopped working. She lowered herself onto a wooden crate outside the medical station and stared at nothing. Her hands, still stained, still trembling, rested in her lap. Someone brought her water. She drank without tasting it. Old János walked to his forge. Looked at the cold coals. Looked at the hammer he'd swung for 9 straight days. He didn't pick it up. He just stood there. Breathing. Letting the silence fill the space where the ringing of iron used to be. Ilona, the seamstress who had become a quartermaster, then a fighter, found herself standing in the courtyard with no task to complete. For the first time since the siege began, nothing needed counting. Nothing needed sorting. Nothing needed carrying to the walls. She didn't know what to do with her hands. Laszlo woke slowly. The blanket someone had draped over him was still there. The sword he'd carried into the breach was gone, taken by an adult who understood that a 10-year-old shouldn't wake up holding a weapon. He sat up. Looked around. Saw the empty valley through the shattered southern wall. Did we win? A soldier nearby, a man whose name Laszlo had never learned, looked down at him. We held, boy. That's better than winning. Bornemissza emerged from his workshop. He carried nothing. His hands were empty for the first time in months. The burns on his fingers had started to blister properly now, the body finally allowed to acknowledge damage it had been ignoring. He walked to the breach. Stood in the gap where the wall used to be. Looked at the scorched ground. The shattered stone. The blood that had soaked into the earth and would stay there for years. His weapons had done this. His barrels. His spears. His hellfire pots. Creations born from desperation and kitchen supplies and sleepless nights of failed experiments. He didn't feel pride. He felt hollow. Exhausted. Grateful. And something else he couldn't name. Dobbo found him there. The wall fell, Captain. But they did not enter. No. They did not. They stood together in silence. 2 men who had bet everything on preparations that shouldn't have worked. 2 men who had watched the math fail and the impossible happen anyway. What will you build now? Bornemissza looked at his empty hands. At the workshop behind him. At the fortress that had survived because of fire and iron and stubborn refusal to accept the obvious outcome. I don't know. Something. When my hands stopped shaking. Winter came early that year. Snow blanketed the valley by mid-November. Covered the scorched earth. Covered the mass graves where Ottoman dead had been buried. Covered the cracks in the walls that masons were already working to repair. Eger rebuilt. Stone by stone. Slowly. The way wounded things heal. Word of the siege spread faster than the snow. Messengers carried the story south to Vienna. Riders took it east to Transylvania. Merchants whispered it in Prague. Sailors repeated it in Venice. By the time winter broke, half of Europe knew the name of a fortress most maps had ignored. 2,000 against 40,000. Bakers and blacksmiths and seamstresses standing beside soldiers. A wall that fell and a people who didn't. Wine barrels packed with gunpowder. A 10-year-old boy charging into a breach. The story grew with each telling. Some details were lost. Others were exaggerated. But the core remained true. Eger held. And that truth changed something. For 26 years, the Ottoman advance had felt inevitable. Fortress after fortress fell. Kingdom after kingdom bent. The momentum seemed unstoppable, a wave that no wall could resist. Eger broke that momentum. Not the empire. The momentum. The belief that resistance was futile. The assumption that fighting back meant dying for nothing. After Eger, that assumption cracked. If a crumbling border fort with no reinforcements could hold against the full weight of Ottoman power, what else might be possible? Vienna took notice. Defensive strategies shifted. Alliances tightened. The psychology of the frontier changed. Eger didn't end the Ottoman threat. Wars would rage for another century. Eger itself would fall in 1596, in a different siege, under different circumstances. But 1552 proved something no defeat could erase. The wave could be stopped. István Dobó became a hero across Hungary. Songs were written. Stories told. His name became a synonym for stubborn, impossible resistance. Gergely Bornemissza, the inventor no one believed in, entered legend as the mad genius who turned farm supplies into weapons that broke an army. But the real story belongs to the unnamed. The blacksmith whose hammer never stopped. The baker who became a healer. The seamstress who kept ammunition flowing and then picked up a sword. The 10-year-old who carried stones until his arms failed and then carried more. They had no training. No military obligation. No oath forcing them to stay. The gates were open. They could have fled before the Ottoman army arrived. Most would have been forgiven. Most would have survived. They chose to stay. They chose to fight beside soldiers who couldn't win without them. They chose the math that didn't work, and made it work anyway. That's the part of this story that reaches beyond 1552. Beyond Hungary. Beyond military history. You will probably never face 40,000 soldiers. You will probably never stand on a crumbling wall while cannons shake the ground beneath your feet. But you will face your own version of that wall. The moment when everyone around you has already accepted the outcome. When the calculations say quit. When every rational voice tells you the fight is over and the only question is how gracefully you lose. And in that moment, you'll have to choose. Kneel. Or hold. The people of Eger made their choice 500 years ago. They didn't know if it would work. They didn't have guarantees. They just decided that the math didn't get to make the final call. And the gate held. The Ottomans had boasted they could turn stone walls into dust. At Eger, dust became defiance. Ashes became iron. And 2,000 ordinary people proved that courage isn't measured in numbers. If this story stays with you, if Eger means something to you now, subscribe to this channel. Because history is filled with moments like this one. Moments where everything should have ended. And didn't. I'll see you in the next one.